So today we are talking about uh, very high level intellectual property strategy for Web3. Um, just like with the auctions, I'm going to like frame and explain why we're even talking about this. Um, because just like with auctions, it's the type of thing that sort of on its face sounds like it's sort of a niche topic, right? But in fact, uh, many different Web3 products, and again, not even just ones that are about digital branding or something of the sort, face some question about IP strategy, especially like when you're building composable protocols, right? There's all this question, and it can be about IP in the sense of brand and media, or just IP in the sense of inventions and protocols and creation. And there are questions of like, what is your strategy around it? How do you decide how your project is going to leverage its IP and the IP created by various community members? To what extent do you want this thing to be very open and sort of public and accessible? To what extent do you want IP to be proprietary? And how do you choose where different parts of the product fall in that spectrum? So one thing is just lots of Web3 projects, even if they don't sort of think of themselves as IP products, are in fact going to be engaging with questions of IP strategy. So many of you will do that. Conversely, novel IP creation has been, in my view, like one of the most sort of breakout, sort of successful and perhaps surprisingly successful applications to date, right? Like, we knew from open source software that it's possible to develop, sort of applications as a community, and that there's like a tremendous amount of value in that when it works. That is itself, sort of an instance of, sort of community composition of IP. Taking that idea, like if you had asked me 5 years ago whether you could take that to brand building or, or the design, like the writing of a book or something like that, I would have thought it was absurdly hard, right? This was not a thing that would have occurred to me that you could build products around. And Web3, and yet Web3 and token design have really proven to be an unlock for that. They've sort of created ways, like new ways of building community-based IP in lots of categories where I would have thought it was previously like, difficult to impossible. And so on the one hand, this is something that like a lot of us are going to use. On the other hand, it's an illustration of like how Web3 can really work well. And then third, even if like, sort of this isn't, this specific application category is not one that really resonates with what you're building. It's an illustration of the Web3 ownership and incentive loop. And so like, we're gonna do a couple of case studies today and sort of try and work out like how different Web3 IP models work, what drives them, when you want to use them, all of that thinking, just like thinking about game theory in the context of auctions is useful for just like understanding how do we do token design. Same thing here, it's like how do we do incentive design in a Web3 project? This is gonna like get us thinking about how that actually works. Okay, so reminder from yesterday, there's this idea of the Web3 opportunity, right? Like shared ownership is about aligning incentives. And I have to say, I've been thinking about Yana's comment essentially nonstop since that session. I guess I took a break for the auction session, but all the open space in my like schedule between like, the end of the first session yesterday and like, starting this session today, I've really been thinking hard about this, sort of idea that this framing of like, you're giving something up, right? This in reference to platform design, this idea that like you're giving something up when you enter into Web3, like you give away some value to your community and, as a way of driving sort of like larger value creation downstream. That actually like, it sort of misses many of the contexts, right? Many of the contexts, we think of Web3 as being purely additive. Right? There's sort of a possibility that the product can be fundamentally more valuable in the end. And that comes just from, that can come from giving up nothing or at least very little. And that's what a lot of these IP strategies actually look like, right? It's super interesting. I like left that talk and I was like, wow, like, actually this IP example is more an instance of purely additive value creation through Web3 than it is sort of about, giving up a part of your brand, right? It's much more, like I talked about in the answer about the hundreds yesterday. It's like, it's much more about sharing ownership as a way of creating something that is bigger and greater than the constituent parts than like chopping up parts and giving them to people somehow. And we'll see that in the IP context we're talking in the different case studies. So I thought that was like, as I say, that was just like a really, really deep insight, and wanted to shout it out and bring it in as part of the frame for today. So cool. What are we doing? So 3 parts. First thing, just like a quick review. What is the purpose of intellectual property? Why do we have this at all? And sort of like, what is it? And then 2 case studies. So we're going to talk about NFT brand building in a sort of both a well, we'll see. We're going to talk about NFT brand building in 2 projects, and then take those ideas and think about what they mean in the context of software, sort of composable software protocols. And then at the very end, and this is going to be like serious lightning round. We might do this in like 7 minutes or something. I'm just going to quickly run you through the basic parameters of an IP design. So if you are in fact like building a crypto project that is centered directly on IP questions, you sort of know what you're asking about, you know what you're thinking about. That, as I say, it's a lightning round. It's going to be a summary, and it is not exhaustive. Like this, just like auctions is an entire field, intellectual property strategy is an entire field. This is purely introductory. If you want more stuff, please come and chat with me. Yeah, it's super interesting, and as you've probably already inferred, I'm a huge IP geek as well as an auction geek, so it should be fun. All right. Footnotes. I am not a lawyer. None of this is legal advice. As you're developing your own IP strategy, you should consult with a lawyer. We are talking about IP business strategy. Actually putting IP designs into practice requires really careful thinking about the legal frameworks as well, but more broadly, just like if you're going to do a business model that is centered on IP, you got to talk to a lawyer early. Second thing, in my slides today, I'm going to use examples drawn from various NFTs I hold. This is actually like demonstrative. I'm using the NFTs in accordance with the IP rights granted through the holder agreements. So it's like a meta illustration of how the whole thing works. This is not in any way an endorsement of those or other specific NFT projects, right? This is like, just I like meta illustration because it's fun. Cool. All right. So what is intellectual property for? Why do we have this? So first thing to do is remember why we have property, right? What is the point of property in the first place? It's a little hard to do in 2 bullets, but if I had to do it in 2 bullets, I would say that well-defined property rights are essential for enabling markets and creating investment incentives. And what do I mean by that? So enabling markets is to enable people to trade in property rights, right? Like if we don't know who owns a given plot of land, it's not possible for someone to, buy or sell it, right? If you have 2 people with like sort of competing claims for the same piece of land, and some third person shows up and says, I want to buy this. Well, who do they buy it from? Right? So one reason you need property rights and well-defined property rights is to enable markets. And by the way, it's not just markets in the property itself, but perhaps, markets derived from the property, right? If I show up and I want to, someone owns a commercial, there's 2 people with competing claims for a commercial building, and I would like to put a restaurant in that commercial building. I don't know who I lease it from, right? Like the derived product gets blocked as well. And so we're losing a lot of value there. And second of all, it's about investment incentives. Just like we talked about with tokens yesterday, if somebody doesn't own something, they don't internalize all the value that's created from improvements, right? So if you're renting an apartment and you feel, really creative and decide to gut the kitchen, you get to enjoy that new kitchen until the end of your lease, but in the end, most of the value accrues to the landlord. In fact, the landlord, if you just improve the kitchen, the landlord might, say, well, gosh, I'm going to raise the rent now because you have a nicer kitchen, and I'll bet I can rent the apartment to somebody else in the future. Whereas by contrast, if you own the house, if you own a house or you own a condo or something, and you replace the kitchen, now you internalize the benefit, right? If first of all, you get to use it for as long as you'd like, assuming, modulo the, kitchen appliances needing to be replaced or whatever down the line, you get to use it for as long as you like. And when you later sell it, you internalize the value. And again, this value and so if you own the house rather than renting the house, you're much more willing to make investments that improve it and then sort of like raise the overall value of the house yourself. This, by the way, also goes for non-transferable forms of property, right? Like human capital, like intellectual, sort of like, your education, all the cool stuff you're learning at crypto startup school and so forth. Like, you're incentivized to invest in all of this new knowledge because then you get to use it, right? You internalize the benefits of gaining the knowledge. So property is important because and again, there are markets on top of that, right? You could build a startup and then do stuff with it. Like, property is important because it creates markets and it creates investment. It enables markets and it creates investment incentives. So intellectual property is about property over ideas, right? In many categories. Idea can be, a protocol, an idea can be an invention, an idea can be a character, an idea can be a story world. And note that unlike, with a house or a piece of land or like, a box of crackers, I have no idea how I came up with that third example. It's just the first thing that came to mind. Idea space is much harder to delineate, right? It's a lot harder to define, what are similar inventions. This is why there's often controversy over whether, some new product does or does not infringe on a patent. But the fundamental purpose of delineating property and idea space is the same, right? It's about, creating incentives for people to develop that intellectual property, right? To invent new products or to design new protocols or to create cool characters and story worlds. And then eventually, often to enable markets in that IP. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but there are lots of different forms of IP protection that exist today, and they have very different legal structures and enforcement mechanisms. So, we've got, miscellaneous footnotes here, copyright, trademark, patent, trade secret, and so forth. We're mostly going to shove all of that stuff under the rug for the purposes of today. Again, if you are doing IP work, talk to a lawyer to figure out how you want to protect the intellectual property that you're working with. But we're going to shove it under the rug today and think about just sort of like IP as a concept, right? Like there's ideas that we have property rights in. So first, mini case, SUP with IP in Web3. Here we have subducts 6484. This is my, my PFP. Subducts have an intellectual property agreement it's a variation of the form that was initially popularized by the Bored Ape Yacht Club, where the holder of the NFT associated to a subduct image has the right to use that image for both, sort of personal use and commercial purposes. So, first of all, here's a personal use. I have included this subduct image in the slides per the IP license, and this excerpt here is from the the terms and conditions, right? So this is actually like an IP right that is granted via sort of external legal contract, right? There's a terms and conditions for the holders of the subducts NFTs, but it says you can use the IP, you can create derivative works, you can even sell them. And so our first just simple puzzle question is why? Right? This is pretty unusual, right? It's very uncommon. In classic brand building, it has not been standard. Let's say for intellectual property creators to just sort of allow anybody who owns a part of an instance of the product to build their own derivatives, right? If I buy a Mickey Mouse T-shirt, I don't then get to produce my own Mickey Mouse cartoons. So why is subducts doing this? Think to yourself for 20 seconds. I know some of you guys actually build domain IP, so you'll have specific views from your own products and projects, which is great, and please bring those to the discussion as well. Think to yourself for 20 seconds, talk to a neighbor for a minute and a half, we'll come back. What do we think? Why would subducts share their IP with holders? Does this make any sense at all?
Hi, Nikita from Chain Patrol.
Awesome.
Well, one thing we were thinking is like, I mean, it's like kind of like free marketing basically. Like, well,
Yeah.
I don't know subducts personally, but I know like we have Pudgy Penguins ourselves, and like everybody in the community makes a ton of, memes out of it, animations, and like everybody. It's like work that their team doesn't have to do. It's whatever the community creates.
Yeah.
It gets posted all over Twitter, all over socials, and everybody gets to see it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? Like it has a huge marketing application.
Yeah.
And it means that, you have a whole community of marketers rather than just, sort of the central brand doing that. Let me stick with you for 1 second. Why does the community do it, right? Why do people post Pudgy Penguins memes? Like what's going on there?
Well, one, it's fun. Like, I think they just like it. That people see it as their identity. Like, when we bought a penguin, like, part of it was speculative, obviously. Like, we just wanted number to go up. But the other part of it was, like, we liked the art, and we actually, like, picked one, like, not because it was, like, on the floor or something, but because we actually paid above floor for the one that we wanted because we were like, oh, this one looks more cute, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
No, absolutely. Right?
yeah.
Like it reinforces this identity aspect. Sorry, go ahead, keep talking.
Yeah. One more thing I just wanted to get your thoughts on is like when people create like, I do think there's like a challenge with it too because people create like kind of like copycat collections or like derivative collections. Like for example, with penguins, they made this thing called mecha penguins, and
Hmm.
so like a couple of thousand in ETH in volume actually went into that project, and we're thinking that's like volume that could have been continually been in the maybe the penguin ecosystem, but then people went and
Yeah.
bought these mecha penguins instead, and are just thinking like, does that also create challenges where people might leave your project and spend money elsewhere?
Absolutely. Great question. Um, so let's ask the room. Pelgy Penguins launches, they give people the right to create derivatives. Someone creates mecha penguins. Now the subducts license says like you can't create new NFTs without like changing more than 75% of the imagery or something like that. But I'll bet the mecha penguins change 75% of the imagery, or
Yeah.
maybe they just allow all commercial NFT derivatives, whatever. So someone creates mecha penguins. This is let's stipulate for the purpose of the thought question, completely okay under the terms of the agreement. There's now 1,000 ETH of volume in mecha penguins. Is this good for pudgy penguins? Bad for pudgy penguins? Indifferent? How do we feel about it? How many people are like, wow, that sounds great. I want that. Got a couple. Okay, so the whoever it is in the back who's got their hand up, please run up and say why. And then, while that person is joining the mic, why how many people are like, no way, this is like super unfortunate. Like I really, really don't want the mecha penguins. Why? Why is this good for why do you argue this is good for the penguins?
Yeah, so I think in the short term, it might be bad, but in the long term, it's probably good because it somewhat broadens the community, right? And
Hmm?
you still sort of end up in a situation where the original project feels aspirational, right? So you might still end up having people who have like the derivative work, but still say over time I'm going to trade this over time and flip it until I end up having like the original thing. So I think fundamentally like derivative communities do end up probably adding some form of value to the base communities,
Yeah.
even if it ends up being medium to long term.
Super interesting. So like, and the question, so does that resonate? Does that feel like the experience of mecha penguins and pudgies?
I'm not as familiar with the whole mecha penguin situation, but I don't think they ever like officially brought them into the community as like like I think they had some like hesitation about like officially associating with them because
Yeah.
I think also the challenge was that like the mecha penguin project was trying to say they were trying to act more as if they were like officially associated, but I think I might be like making things up here to be honest, but I think like the original Pudgy Penguins project was trying to like not fully associate with them, like, and so
Yeah.
but then you see examples with like um, there was like these mutant hound callers and like Yuga Labs, and there I think they actually did say something like the mutant hounds, which weren't officially a Yuga project, but they would end up being in like the other side game as like actual avatars, and I think they managed to get a partnership there, maybe or something along those lines. So
Yeah.
in that case, like it's like different. I feel like different communities handle it in different ways. Some people want to keep their IP private, but or like not as easily make those like, oh yeah, you made a derivative, so now you're kind of part of the community. But then with Yuga, I think they did manage to make some of those partnerships happen.
Love it. That is this conversation is prefacing literally what's on the next slide. So I'm loving this. Let's do one more comment and then we'll recap. Um,
Hi, I'm JP from Friends. So
Awesome.
actually, I think I have a slightly different opinion. I think in the short term, it's like neutral to positive for the original
Yeah.
project. The reason it's neutral to positive is because it drives up additional demand for the existing project, because people are like, well, all these people want to buy this other thing because they are priced out or they missed out on the
Yep.
original project. So it could feel positive, but in the long run, I actually think it's negative. And the reason I think the second order effects are negative is because most of the time when you look in practice, these derivative projects, they're only copying the art. They're not actually doing anything unique with the community. So the community that you joined is like a shell of the community of the original. So you end up without community cohesion, which is something you talked about yesterday. So you join these
Yep.
shell projects, and then you end up realizing that you did not buy the thing that you thought you were going to buy. And a lot of people end up feeling pretty disillusioned by both projects. More likely the derivative project they bought into. So that could hurt the original project, where people are like, well, now they might feel negative things around that brand, even though that brand did not create this derivative project.
Absolutely. I love it. Okay, this is the tension, right? This is the question. It's like we're adding new derivatives to the ecosystem, right? We're inviting people to create derivatives. When they create commercial derivatives, there's a risk that they might create commercial derivatives that in one fashion or another, harm the brand. Maybe it takes people away. Maybe it just it's not very good. It's sort of like, they tried to make like cool robotic penguins and they actually got sort of like weird looking penguins that don't quite look like robots, don't quite look like penguins. They're neither fish nor fowl. They're neither robot nor fowl or something. On the one hand, sharing IP encourages people to create derivatives. This expands the brand footprint, this expands the brand's reach, but it's not without risk, right? There's this possibility that someone might create just like a low quality or an offensive derivative. There is at the same time, like in this conversation, in the comment about mutant hounds, right? There's a semi-permeable membrane between the brand and the fan products, right? It's still the case that there is a core brand. Pudgy Penguins can decide not to absorb the Mecha Penguins, or if they really like the Mecha Penguins, right? If they turned out that it was like really great for the for the brand, for the ecosystem, then maybe they could bring it in house, or they could do some sort of partnership. This is, to my understanding, what Yuga has done with the Mecha collars. Keep saying it wrong. The mutant collars. Mecha Hounds probably is a derivative somewhere out there, I bet, but that's not the one. Mutant Hounds, where there's shared IP and co-development of game assets and things like that, and so Web3 has enabled this model where you can sort of share ownership. You can grant sort of this broader license to create derivatives. And then you as the brand have some degree of control of what actually, sort of feeds back in. You can't control it entirely, right? You can't, sort of, once you've granted a license to create a derivative, you can't sort of take, you can't post hoc say, never mind, we didn't like that derivative. Again, I am not a lawyer. That is not I'm not making this as a legal statement. I'm making it as a heuristic statement about how IP strategy and policy works. But you do have control of what becomes part of the sort of part of the ecosystem. And here we have my subduct in lots of different variations. The bottom left is my subduct decked out in Hanukkah attire by a community member, Freddie Lowry, who was doing such a good job of creating subduct derivatives in various costumes that the official sort of subducts team invited Lowry in as sort of a collaborator, and he got like a subducts tailor shop in the subducts boardwalk, right? So you literally, there's this instance of like somebody from the community who was just creating really cool derivatives that people liked and were buying, right? They were buying it using the Volt currency, becoming part of it. Second image there, you're seeing bored and dangerous. In fact, sadly, subducts were not, eligible. It was only apes and mutants. But subducts can be included in other derivative projects, including sort of the more recent Tally Labs podcast that's Jenkins of LA podcast that's forthcoming from Tally Labs. And then up there, you can always print your ducks on mugs. What is it that stops these things from, stops communities from creating especially low quality derivatives on the margin? Mostly, where's the protection come from? The hope is that it comes from that shared ownership, right? It's and this is not perfect, right? If somebody really wanted to acquire a token for the sake of producing something really ugly or something, they, and they had the means with which to do so, they could. But if your right to produce the derivatives, if you're producing a collection of mecha penguins, and to do that you need to buy 100 penguins or something of the sort, or mecha ducks and you need 100 ducks, you're at least somewhat indexed on the brand, right? You have a shared and aligned incentive to try and make something that's good. Doesn't mean you're going to succeed. Doesn't mean you necessarily know how to do it or have the opportunity to, but it does mean that there is some of that alignment there. Footnote, as I said before, those IP agreements are structured via contract. At least at present, most of these agreements are not enforced on chain, although I've heard people thinking about prototypes for how you might enforce certain types of IP agreements on chain. Mostly right now, this is all enforced through the legal system. Reminder, I am not a lawyer. One more sort of NFT example, just to plan. So we just talked about creators sharing IP with holders. Another model is to share IP that we've seen popularized here that's sort of akin to what we saw, the sort of one of the core IP models in open source software is CC0, no rights reserved. You're not just granting rights to holders, you're granting them to everyone. And so, what does this mean? It's it's open source, but for brand IP. And there's this related question of why the heck would you do that? We can think it through, right? It's what's happening? We're going to create many derivatives, and we're inviting creation of derivatives from anyone now. We have no control over what types of derivatives they might produce. And also note that the value from those derivatives, when I produce a duck, a mug with my subduct and sell, subduct mugs to people, that value accrues to holders, and I have that shared incentive along with the brand because I am a holder. Here, you don't necessarily, right? And there's not necessarily a mechanism by which that value directly accrues to holders, right? It's not that holders are authorized to sell hats with their with the characters on it. Well, rather they are, but so is everybody else. So in a second, we're going to think about how does value capture here? How does this drive value back into the original brand? But here's a sort of CC0 progression. So this is the Blitmap logo from from an early CC0 collection called Blitmap, which then appeared on a hat in the Chain Runners. And then people liked the hat, so they and Chain Runners is CC0 as well. They liked the hat, so they actually produced the hat. Sort of a a Blitmap and Chain Runners collector produced the hat with the Blitmap logo from the Chain Runners collection. And then that hat became memed. So in the Elite Skulls collection, where I'm one of the SIRs, the 532s, we had a trait which was a variation of the hat featuring the logo. And of course, all of these collections are CC0, which means in particular that this NFT I'm including here is not mine, right? There is a holder. I actually don't remember off the top of my head who the holder is. I don't think I know this person personally. But because it's CC0, I can just include it in my slide. So I had to include one of my subducts to use a subduct. But all of these, I actually don't hold any of these assets, although I have one of the hats coming in the mail. Similarly with loot, right? Loot introduced a very simple primitive, right? Just lists of items that you might have in adventure games. And people have built on top of them lots of different architectures. They've built games that use those lists as sort of core items. They've built characters that interact with those items and then make sense in the games. They've done storytelling. There are all these projects with people writing stories in the lootverse, and even leveling infrastructure. These assets don't have the ability to level up, but you can stack assets and compose around them in ways that level up. here you have all these like different, like some like really serious dev teams, like building games that sit on these assets that they did not create. And so what's going on here? Relative to holders only IP, there's a much larger network of people who might build, right? It's literally everyone. But a lot of them are, sort of are not owners. And so the question is the asset something that can create enough value for the people who build on it to want to build on it? And then, as I said, how does it feed back? So when do we think CC0 is a good idea? When might you want to just totally open up IP? Same thing. Let's think to ourselves for 20 seconds, then talk to a neighbor for a real minute and a half, and then we'll come back. All right. When CC0? Does it make sense? When does it make sense?
Hey, Scott. E-Man here from Shield.
Awesome.
So I think there's a couple trends that I've seen with CC0 projects. They tend to be very memeable. So
Yes.
thinking about nouns, goblins, I believe goblins is CC0.
Yep,
MFers,
absolutely.
they're all projects that are very, very, so one is memeable and two is I think typically these projects haven't had a very clear roadmap or direction from a central team. And I think those are the types of projects where it opens up a lot more possibility for, okay, the community, you guys can take this wherever you want. There's this kind of central meme, but beyond that, it's really whatever you guys want to do. It's very different compared to Bored Apes, where there is, in a sense of a more clear roadmap and direction that's being led by a specific team.
Yep. Awesome. I love it. Spot on, right? What's making these tick? It's I like to call them building blocks. Memes is exactly right. It's the primitives, the fundamental unit in Goblin Town, the fundamental unit in Loot. These are assets that are very easy to build and reference and meme and create on top of. And on the other hand, exactly as you said, right? They benefit a lot from that because, they generate this attention among very broad communities. But in fact, the creators themselves, sort of didn't have, sort of at least didn't express a desire to build, sort of the full scale of the thing they really wanted to build along with the community and their experimentation. So it's both, it lowers the cost of experimenting, right? It's something that can embed into lots of different experiments. And the project design is set up to embrace the experiments in the first place. Spot on. Thanks. Perfect. So what's the key? What have we been watching in both of these contexts, right? The derivatives have to drive value back to the original brand and brand assets on average, right? It doesn't have to be every single derivative of a goblin or of Loot or, a subduct or whatever is actually creating value for subducts. But on average, in fact, the goblin's creating value for subducts, I don't know. It doesn't have to create value for their parent brand, but on average, the derivative has to create value for the parent brand. And this is very much just the way that within community, creating stuff, right? Even if it's not built on top of IP, just people creating new t-shirts or having Twitter spaces or whatever, creates, ways of driving value back to the assets. We don't have time to do this as a discussion block, unfortunately, but the real challenge question we talked on in the first session about value capture is how do you then capture the value from derivatives? We've seen some illustrations already so far in the session, right? Subducts can absorb some of the, the best derivatives through a semi-permeable membrane. Pudgy Penguins could do that. Any of these projects can, if there's something that's really good and that they think is building the brand in the direction that they want to build, they can partner, they can even acquire, right? They can sort of make fan projects canon, which by the way is one of the coolest things about Web3 brand IP, right? How awesome is it that you can be really, really good at creating subduct costumes and then become part of subducts? All of those costumes get retconned in as the subducts Halloween. With Blitmap and Loot, right? With these CC0 projects, you actually need something stronger, right? It's not just, it's not just that the team could absorb projects, but you really need the value to feed back into demand for the original assets, right? And to sort of grow the value of the brand beyond the extent to which sort of things sort of drift, things borrow from it, right? So like the cool thing about the Blit cap is that a lot of people had never heard of Blitmap and they learned about it because of chain runners, and like that's pretty cool, right? It's like a way of like sweeping many new people into your communities, but as the things get more memed out, you have to like make sure that that value comes back to the core. And that's like, the Noggles, like the Nouns glasses are like really good at that, right? They're sort of like instantaneously recognizable. Even if you have no idea what they are, you can like recognize that they are a brand asset. And it's important to make sure that that link eventually drives value for things from the core brand, right? To be able to capture that value as well. By the way, just as a footnote, a contract type that was successful in a number of open source software contexts, but that I haven't seen as much. There are a few examples. It's a little bit like what Forgotten Runes does, I believe. That there haven't seen nearly as many versions of in NFT space are contracts that basically allow free creation of derivatives, but like some degree of revenue share on commercial derivatives or commercial derivatives over a certain scale. So then you get all the memes, right? Like you've directly invited people to meme, but like when they end up having sort of like a really successful sort of commercial breakout follow-up project, the brand shares some of the upside. That was like a very successful model for certain open source software products. And as I say, it's much less common in NFT space. Probably in part because it's very hard to do on chain at the moment, but like we could certainly imagine versions of that down the road. Anyhow, all right. So as we just saw, it was just said, embeddedness is important, has to like, drive value back to the original assets, right? It's important for loot. Actually, let me make that point like one more time in a slightly different way. It's important for loot that all these games be built on the original loot assets, right? If you bring your loot bag into any loot-verse game, that's got to be great. It has to be like you want to own the best loot bag because it gives you the best items in all the different games. Corollary / footnote, sharing IP, very much not always optimal, right? Many firms benefit from brand curation. And perhaps, and especially in a world where there's a lot of memeing and derivative experimentation, you might actually think that the value to having a like very well curated brand is much higher. We're even, footnote on the footnote, we're seeing some established brands starting to like sort of tiptoe into this sort of experimentation. So like Hottie Toes released this Bones NFT collection where you get personal use rights and some very limited commercial rights, mostly around merchandise and stuff. And it seems that they're very carefully looking at like what that encourages, right? Like, they're a different set of like iconography from their main brand assets, but they're clearly related. And so there are ways to like sort of experiment and try this out as you go as well. I'm gonna just like tell you very quickly, this is a summary slide for open versus proprietary NFTs. This just like summarizes everything we just saw. There's a second summary slide that sort of extrapolates that same observation to protocols, right? So if you have a proprietary protocol, then the IP creators incentivize all of the value they create, which means they sort of have maximal incentive to invest in development. But it means development can be much slower because people aren't sharing their IP around, right? Like, if someone invents some, sort of a really cool idea, then other people either have to like reinvent it or invent around it or something of the sort. Fully open, protocol development, it's much harder to internalize value, easier to become embedded, and also the marginal return on investment is higher, right? Because like, there's more development that can happen on top of your software, like, and also it often becomes less costly to develop because there's all of the sort of open library to build on. And so thinking about these types of trade-offs are what's going to calibrate your decisions about how open versus how proprietary to be. It's like, how much does opening the IP enable people to like produce things that are valuable for the overarching project versus relative to the additional difficulties it creates in those creators capturing value. Ultra lightning round in like 4 minutes, basic parameters of an IP design. You have to decide what is the IP unit, like what are the rights, who has them, and then how are they licensed, transferred, and so forth. Often, and again, lots of crypto projects are in one fashion or another about using tokens to define the IP asset, right? Or to at least define, make the, to allocate the IP asset. The IP asset also doesn't live in the token, but is like attached to it by contract or chain reference, but the IP sort of construct is attached to the token. Lots of questions about which types of rights you might want to wrap up in that token. We already talked about personal use and commercial use. There's also, do you want to let people sub-license? Like, can I take my, token linked asset and like, grant that IP to somebody else? Thing that is, sort of not nearly thought about as much as it should, although I know some of you guys are working on it. How are the derivatives linked to the originals? Right? To what extent does new creation sort of like directly relate to the original product? Then what are the IP policies? How are they enforced? And again, who internalizes, sort of the results? I think at one point we're going to see this stuff happening on chain. Or I think and I hope and I sort of expect that like at some point a lot of this stuff is going to be managed on chain. There'll be just sort of like, flexible markets and a lot of different types of IP licenses. But right now, this is mostly at least enforced via off-chain mechanisms. And like, that's okay, right? Like we talked about progressive decentralization yesterday, like IP enforcement in the, in the physical world isn't perfect, but it's actually like, pretty good, right? This is like, there's been a lot of careful structured work on like how to define and manage and enforce IP rights. And so leveraging those institutions, is a great idea, at least until, we figure out ways to do it on chain as well. And then lastly, and this is very important, right? People can't invest, right? Property rights aren't useful if people don't understand who has them. And in particular, if they don't understand that they have them. And so the extent that you are sharing IP with your community, you have to create those rights, you have to clarify them to people, and you have to make them durable. And as I said, you're going to hear from Miles soon, but let me just quickly shout out his work with a number of collaborators on these can't be evil licenses, where the contract itself, so it's a legal contract, but the contract itself is encoded on chain, and then can be embedded in a smart contract for reference as a way of making that commitment durable. Right, sort of guaranteeing that the project creator can't just like change the terms of service on a lark, because the terms of service for IP are in effect in the smart contract. And this type of innovation, by the way, again, is not limited to IP. We talked yesterday about just like credible commitments are useful for investment and for getting people to like buy into your platform. This is a great example of it, but I think there are many others. So if you're doing IP, you got to understand what is the unit. What are the associated policies, and how are those policies codified and maintained? And then, why are we doing this? Again, it's like, what will that IP structure incentivize in terms of behavior, and how does it feed back into the value of the product? So, it's sort of like it's like a fixed point problem, right? You're trying to craft a policy that incentivizes a specific type of behavior, then figure out how you implement that policy and confirm that it's going to actually drive that behavior. And all of this, again, like with all of our other Web3 examples, it's really about how does that behavior among users drive value back into the project and make it a greater whole than it ever could have been before. Oh, and just quick footnote on that greater whole thing. Like, this is an instance that's true, in my view, like, reflecting on Jana's comment from yesterday, is many times truly additive, right? Like the subducts didn't have costumes, but giving people the right to create costumes for subducts suddenly created this whole new part of the subducts ecosystem that made them a better product for everyone. And so that's a sense in which Web3 is really like truly adding, right? It's not like, the subducts creators gave up the right, their own right to build costumes for the ducks. In fact, they didn't. They literally could introduce that product tomorrow. Like, who knows? Maybe it was on the roadmap and they didn't need to. Maybe it's still on the roadmap. Maybe they were never thinking about it. But whatever the case, all they did was invite somebody else to create costumes in a fashion that's supplemental to all the rights they have. And like, what do you know? You get costumes. Everyone's showing off their ducks in Halloween costumes and holiday, outfits and stuff. That's pretty cool. So anyhow, it really feeds back into this, and again, I'm reflecting on this more and more, like, since yesterday, like this sort of purely additive Web3 opportunity that really is sort of a, I don't know, a great way to think about it. Cool. So what behavior do you want to incentivize? How do you implement that? And don't forget to consult a lawyer. QED.
I'm not sure if I missed this part, but let's say I have something that I have the IP license to because I own the NFT. I've signed some
Yep.
agreements with other people, and then I sell that NFT. What exactly happens
Great.
in that case?
Oh, great question. Okay. And again, so I'm not a lawyer, and this varies from contract structure to contract structure. So what the question is, I have an NFT which grants me, say, commercial rights to produce t-shirts with my subduct on it. I sublicense those rights to, a t-shirt producer, right, who's going to produce shirts with ducks. And then, I sell my duck. Does the t-shirt producer still have the rights to produce those shirts? And there's questions of, can they produce new ones? Are the ones that they've already produced still things they can sell? All of these categories. And who makes money if they do sell them? These rights are specified by term of contract. One of the components of the design of those can't be evil licenses I mentioned is that they address this case in a very smooth way, right? Like rights and sublicenses cut off at the moment of transfer. Not all, to my knowledge, not all NFT IP agreements like clearly specify this one way or another. But again, this is like a reason it's really important to think through carefully, like what all the different use and edge cases are. One likes to think that people who, buy their duck and then create t-shirts off of the duck are never going to sell it. By the way, I don't remember off the top of my head whether the subducts agreement deals with sublicenses. I'm just using the duck as an example. Is never going to sell it, but in fact they might. And you need a smooth process for adjudicating like what happens to sublicenses or even the original holders' rights, right? If they produced a series of t-shirts themselves with the duck on them, can they continue selling those shirts after the fact? Really important to work through these types of details. And also to clarify how those details are specified, because that's important for someone evaluating whether they want to buy the asset or not. Great question.
Awesome.
And the answer is important to think through.
Hey, thanks again for another excellent talk. I think yesterday we kind of covered defensibility through network effects and a number of other properties. And today, it seems like we're talking about kind of the benefits of distribution that you can get through mutual incentives with IP and communities. How do you think about IP in terms of defensibility in the face of maybe adversarial entities at the boundary of Web 2 and Web 3? Because I think Web 2 companies are pretty aggressive about claiming territory, and in Web 3 we're much more community oriented. So what are your thoughts about strategy there?
First of all, I think we're seeing. My answer to this one again is opinion. I don't think there's a known like true answer to this question yet. Like what's going to happen with your sort of classic IP, and both Web 2 type classic IP and also historic classical IP, right? Like sort of brands that have existed for centuries. But I think what we're seeing with the historic IP, sort of brands that have existed for centuries, is that a lot of them are realizing that there is value to sort of sharing bits of their brand with their greatest enthusiasts, right? And we're seeing this not just with like clothing brands, but also with media properties. And I guess Porsche recently, sort of released an NFT project where part of the utility is they're inviting their holders to like come in and like sort of talk to Porsche designers and sort of like, sort of to some degree advise on and shape the future of the company.
Just one small refinement. So not so much the brand side, but the actual underlying technical innovations, like the patenting strategy.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Good. Sorry, totally right. Okay, let me finish the story on the brands for a second, and then we'll talk about patents. Right. So I think that they're like seeing that there is value. You're seeing that there's value there, but if you look at how these companies are doing it, they're doing it in a very different way, right? They're sort of, they're not sharing the core brand IP. They're sort of trying to experiment and explore how like you can add more to it and sort of through the Web3 space, mostly. Other thing is sort of Web 2, Web 2 and Web 3 interactions. I think there's a lot of tension right now about whether the Web 2 platforms are going to be strongly incentivized to let the Web 3 content in, right? Like, Twitter linking, sort of linking to NFT wallets and introducing sort of verified NFT profiles. Instagram talking about doing that and then suddenly not. You know, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure as people like start to build up libraries of digital assets that they own. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure for Web2 companies to let those assets in. Whether, you know, how that pressure relates to those companies' incentives to keep their ecosystems closed and walled, I don't know. We'll have to see how it plays out, but I think at least they're going to be under a lot of market pressure for it. Now, on your question as, you know, sort of on tech. So the interesting thing, first of all, is that, you know, Web 2, and again, this is highly overgeneralized, like, but Web 2 has had sort of an interesting relationship with tech IP. On the one hand, a lot of the Web 2 giants have extremely locked down, you know, control of their core IP. Think of like the Google, you know, the Google search algorithm, you know, or Amazon's like recommendation system and stuff like that. On the other hand, they've actually like done a lot of work to try and create a very large like public patent space of a lot of their secondary innovations as sort of like a combination like territory claim and like litigation blocker, which was sort of like a really strange, you know, you'll hear the term patent thicket. It's like sort of this funny, like, you know, almost like accident of sort of all these companies trying to prove that they have lots of types of IP to block litigation from their competitors and from third parties. I think what we are likely to see, again, this is strong conjecture and opinion, who the heck knows? I think we're likely to see that like that patent thicket type activity sort of morph into like more like Web3 shared IP with cross licensing and more open development. Because I think that's fundamentally like the most market efficient mode for it to exist. I say again as an opinion. On the like proprietary algorithms and things, I think we're actually like, not only are like Web 2 companies going to continue to keep those private, but we're going to see some degree of privacy of that in Web 3 also, right? Like if you have the best recommender algorithm, you might want to share that with people in order to embed it into other software and like, you know, get it to be the central recommender algorithm of the Web 3 internet. Or you might want to keep it as proprietary as possible and like monetize it. And I think it's important to recognize that these two business models are going to coexist. And the question is, how do you make them integrate in a way that creates the maximum amount of value, right? Like some IP is only worth investing in if you really internalize all the benefits at the end. But by the same token, like I think Web3 is going to raise the value and the opportunity for these IPs that are like, you know, core components that are like primitives that you can build on, like reputation signals and so forth. And so I think it's not that we're going to like lose that proprietary stuff. Like it's going to exist forever, or likely to exist forever, but we're going to get a big boost to the things that can be shared and sort of composed upon. Anyhow, sorry, really long, you know, first long answer to the question. It wasn't actually the one you were asking, then long answer to the question you were asking, but hopefully that helps.
That was a great answer. Thank you.
Thanks.
Similar to Brandon, my question is, how do you retain value capture, scarcity, or just creative control over like CC0 assets? Is this something you should even try to do?
Great question. I mean, you know, I think creative control is impossible, right? Like, in fact, you know, we saw this with Leet Skulls. Some project, some anonymous person or team created a spin-off project that was really, really heavily mashing up the Leet Skulls artwork and the imagery and the Chain Runners imagery, and really looked like it was probably a rug, right? Like there was, you know, there was no way to know, but it just like didn't like they sort of they had this sort of like sensation, and like they didn't reach out to any of us, like, you know, sort of, you know, just happening sort of independently, and the Skulls team decided sort of as a group that it was important to explicitly say, look, this thing is not affiliated with us. We're like, you know, we haven't heard anything from them. We've tried to get in contact and haven't been able to successfully. We're not sure what to make of it. But you know, per the terms of the license, it's not like there's anything we do to like stop that project, right? It's completely, you know, permitted under CC0 for somebody else to like take the imagery, even the exact same imagery if they wanted, and like, you know, create a rug. Whether that's like legally, you know, sort of appropriate or whatever, completely different story, right? Like again, I am not a lawyer. There are all sorts of challenges to that on other grounds, but not on the use of the imagery, right? And so the best we could do was just tell the community, like, look, this isn't us. We don't think they're really in any way affiliated. They don't seem to be community members. Like, you know, it seems very risky. So you can't maintain creative control.
But you can like
can maintain some degree of curation in what you surface, right? Like by contrast, there was like a really great community project recently, and like you draw a lot of attention to it. Say, look, this is someone who's in the community who's doing something super cool, and so you can modulate in that way. And then how do you capture value? And again, it's very hard. I mean, we haven't really seen it's early days in the land of CC0 NFTs to know whether any of them are going to really be able to successfully capture value over the long term. But I think it seems to me that it's possible. And the way it would happen is if the sort of popularization of those brand assets and the value that sort of like accrues to them, and to sort of their derivatives and sort of all the things that they sort of support in the ecosystem, brings a lot of demand to be associated to the core project, right? Either to like have those loot bags so that you can be embedded, you can like play with them in the various loot games, or just to like, have something like a noun or a chain runner or whatever. So you can be part of the community that is the central entity. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're going to see like a lot of work towards building those central entities and or embedding the CC0 project in lots of like high quality derivatives, because those are the two ways that drive value back to the original assets.
Right. So it seems like the core project still has branding and signaling power to, say, reactively prevent grifts and rugs.
Absolutely. I mean, like but it requires a team. But if you want to do that, the team has to be very active, right? They have to be paying attention. They have to be like sort of managing how they're sort of how the visible surface of their brand sort of is built on, and recognizing, equally important, is recognizing really, really high quality derivatives and community contributions. By the way, this isn't just for CC0, this is all of like crypto, right? Recognize really high quality derivatives and community contributions and elevate them and help those people build and help other people build alongside them.
Yeah, like the marquee users from yesterday.
Exactly. Yeah. It's almost like discovering the marquee users, right? Like what these like IP strategies do is they let you discover marquee users you might never have known about otherwise.
Got it. Thank you.
Awesome. Well,
cool.
Everyone join me in thanking Scott Kominers once again. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, guys. You are so awesome.